All right, hey, Phil Ebner here with the Photography Masterclass and Video School Online, and today I'm on another photo adventure with my pup. So today I'm out with my Canon 70D and the 24mm Pancake lens that I have, another really affordable lens that opens up to an f2.8 so you can get that nice shallow depth of field. We're down at Cal State Fullerton. We actually drove down with my wife who's going to work, and she dropped us off here, and I figured there might be some cool architecture and stuff here that we can take some pictures of. So we're gonna go take some photos and see what we can get, and hopefully show you that you don't need the most expensive camera or lens out there to take great photos. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why I'm using this lens and the benefits and some of the drawbacks to it. As I started out, I just started taking some kind of nature shots of the plants around, and then I noticed this cool sort of Titan sign. That's the mascot for Cal State Fullerton. So I went there, tried to get a couple shots of it, both just straight on with the letters and then also putting some foreground elements and also framing with a tree that was close by, and I thought those photos ended up looking a lot better. So anyways, with this 24mm prime lens, that means that it doesn't zoom in or out, and that's why it's pretty tight on my face right now. It's not the perfect lens for vlogging, but I do like this lens for the price and the quality. It's really small, so it makes a great travel lens. It keeps the setup really nice and light, and so again, great for travel. It does have a very close focus, meaning I can go up really close to items or objects to take photos of them, which is great for getting those tight shots of plants and things like that. I guess the biggest drawback is that on a crop sensor 24mm, it's kind of right in the middle. It's not really a great telephoto, it's not really a wide. You're really going to have to move yourself in or out to get the right shot you want. But being in that sort of middle range, I do find that it's a great lens for just kind of walking around. So I got a couple photos that I think I like, but I want to keep going and test things out, try to get a little bit more experimental. There's no school on campus. It's the start of summer break here, so there's not too many people to take photos of, so I'm really gonna be just focusing on more of the architecture and the still life. So anyways, let's go.
The next interesting shot I got was when I was walking down just some of the pathways. I saw this big sort of board where people would put all of their posters and signs for events that would be happening during the school year. Since this was right after the school year finished, I thought it was kind of an interesting scene, and these pictures hopefully tell that story as kind of an experimental way to tell that story of just this board with all this ripped paper, these staples in it with little bits of signs and posters that probably had some really cool events going on. So I just walked around, adjusted my settings to be able to expose properly. You can see that I was opened up to an f2.8 aperture, letting in a lot of light with that shallow depth of field, so compensating with a higher shutter speed in this shot of 1/1000th. Here's a shot from the other side. I think it was a little bit too dark, but I was exposing to the paper itself rather than the background, and so we have this bigger piece of paper that's just completely ripped to shreds, just trying to tell the story of that day with it being the end of school. As I was walking around, I did catch some people walking by. I think they were going to some sort of summer camp or something, and they were carrying these big giant boxes of what looks like Subway or donuts or something. And I just quickly snapped these photos. I wasn't able to frame them up really properly or get too many shots because they were just walking by. But it's a good idea just to keep your eye out, be on the lookout, be ready to snap shots of people, because usually people shots or photos of people are a little bit more interesting than just still life. And as a photographer, I know it's challenging even for myself to be taking pictures of people on the street, but it's a good challenge to have, and you usually end up with something a little bit more interesting. So the composition, not the most amazing, interesting photo, but just capturing something that was happening, and them carrying these giant boxes was kind of funny. I also took a few shots of this flower, and I took a few different styles of shots to show you the difference between using an wide open aperture with the shallow depth of field and then a more closed down aperture, just to see the difference. I feel that people automatically try to open up their aperture to get that very shallow depth of field, to get that more artistic look. And I often actually prefer that myself, but it doesn't have to be your go-to. So this one, f2.8, you can see that just the very center, that those little pieces sticking out from the center of the flower are in focus. The petals behind, which are just a couple inches behind it, are out of focus. So this to me is a very much more artistic shot. In this next shot, I used an f7.1. The petals are in focus, that center is in focus, the background is a little bit more in focus. And in this case, I actually like the more shallow depth of field. I moved over and centered the flower here, still with the f7.1. I got everything on the flower in focus. The background is still out of focus though. The next shot, I switched to f3.2. I just got the center of that flower in focus and then the petals behind it out of focus. In this shot, I feel like it's almost too much out of focus. Some people might like this. Some people might like just everything being blurry. But to me, I like the previous shot. I also went a little bit further and did an f13. Now the petals, the center, and the background are more in focus. But the background is just subtly kind of in focus. It's still not perfectly sharp. And so I like the previous shot of f7.1 where the background is a little bit blurrier, so the focus really is on the flower. In the shot with the f13, your eye it's still drawn to that flower because that is the main subject, but the background is a little bit more distracting. So this is a case where not having a super shallow depth of field like f3.2 or f2.8 with this lens, I actually preferred it with a little bit closed down aperture of the f7.1.
So behind me you can't really see because it's blown out right now, but I found a sort of cool architecture with a couple of ramps going up, and then down below there's kind of a tree, and I thought it was kind of cool shooting up at this. Now I came up the ramp and I'm shooting back down. Now one of the issues I've run into with the 24mm lens is it's not that wide, and so I think a cool shot would be if I was to get this whole sort of view with the pillars and the symmetry and the framing of the view behind it, but I can't do that with one shot. So I did end up taking 3 shots, and I'm gonna put them together, stitch them together to create a panorama to get that wider angle and just see how it looks. Another thing is that it's pretty overcast right now, so the lighting isn't too interesting, but I'm looking and trying to see places where I can get some interesting shadows. So that's kind of what I'm going to try to get next as I walk around, just getting some interesting shadows, even with the cloud cover that kind of disperses the light and gives a lot of even lighting. So let's head out and see what I can get.
Walking around looking for some architecture, I found the Kinesiology and Health Sciences building. So first I got Ashby to sit in the middle of this tunnel. We got some nice backlight that really separates Ashby from the background and a lot of foreground light shining on her face so that she was well exposed. I'm going to back up and you can see what this actually looked like. So here's the building. I thought it had some interesting colors, some interesting lines, some interesting exposures with the contrast of the dark inside the tunnel and then the light outside. And so this was just your standard shot, standing eye level straight onto the building. It's a neat photo, but I was trying to figure out how I could make this photo a little bit more interesting. So the first thing I thought was if I stepped over to my right, I can have more of a leading line with that architecture, the beam at the top right, and the curve of the building. A little bit more interesting, but still at eye level. So I crouched down and took another shot. I thought this was even more interesting, more of the rule of thirds with that sign for kinesiology and health science on that rule of thirds intersection. What I don't like about this photo is the trash can in the bottom right hand corner. Super distracting to me. So what I did next was I got forward a little bit more to crop out that trash can, and this ended up being my favorite shot. I just like it. It's a little bit more dynamic than the straight on shot. Both of these are decent shots. The colors, the reds and oranges from the building, contrasting with the blues of the windows and the blues in the background. I like that a lot. Using the rule of thirds, some leading lines, and just overall an interesting sort of shot. I kept walking and found this building, which I thought was, again, kind of interesting. A great color, great curve to it. The issue that I had with this one was the sky. The sky was really bright and it was being backlit. The sun was backlighting the building. So the face of this building was a little dark, so I had to crank up my exposure, even though my shutter speed was 1/2000th, I had to crank it up, so that resulted in the sky being a little bit overexposed. I moved forward to see if this would be a little bit more interesting, getting close up, sort of cropping out all of the distractions just to get this building and the sky. And then I looked up even higher, or tilted up, and I got this shot with a lot of negative space. I really like this shot. I edited it in black and white. The only thing I think would make this better is if the sky had a little bit more detail. Now, Adobe Lightroom Classic does have a dehaze filter that allows you to bring back some information in things like clouds or hazy skies. But when you do that, it can start to look a little artificial. And so I used a little bit of that dehaze to get some of that information back. But if there was a clear blue sky or some other details in the clouds, it probably would be a more interesting photo. I found this really cool boat, or half of a boat, that was kind of looked like it was sticking out of the ground. And so this first shot I actually think is my favorite of this set, using symmetry and balance centering this boat. I just thought it was a cool shot and kind of random, but kind of cool. I then moved over to the side using more of the rule of thirds to see what this actually was, because the previous shot could seem a little abstract. In this shot, you can see that building that I had previously shot in the background. And then I moved up closer just to get more of the textures of that boat. So here you can see the rusted boat, and you see actually the name of the boat, the CB, behind. And I got a couple shots of that, both kind of looking out. And I think actually I would rotate this photo once to the left to have the text being horizontal, even though the sky and the ground would be off kilter. I think that would be a more interesting photo. And then this is another shot looking down at the text. And I still use that shallow depth of field, knowing that you could still read the text CB, but I think this is more artistic and more interesting than if everything in the shot was in focus. And with this close-up shot, you can really start to see the vignetting of this lens. This is completely natural. It's not something I did in post, but the vignette you really get to see with this lens when you're closer up.
So the sun did start to peek out a little bit, but I'm not finding that much luck with some cool lighting shots. What I did find were a couple cool kind of tunnels where it was really light at one end, and that kind of lent itself to some cool shots. And then I found a really cool building with this nice pattern on the outside, and that was one of my favorite shots of the day. I got up right under the corner of it, and so it kind of created this pyramid or this triangle that is very symmetrical. So just walking around, taking pictures of Ashby, she's a good sport. And one thing that I always tell people if they're taking pictures of their pets or their kids is to get down and get at eye level with. This usually creates a more dynamic, interesting photo. Just like you would want to take a photo that's right at eye level or maybe a little bit above eye level. If you're taking a portrait of a person, it's important to get down there close to eye level with your pet or your kid. I think those photos do end up looking a little bit better.
So lastly, I was just walking around campus, and one thing I like to do when I go to a new place is look on Google and just search for images of the place that I'm at to see if there's any more iconic sort of spots or styles, to see if I want to try to replicate that myself or do it in my own style. And so as I was walking towards where I thought the front of campus was, I just got a couple of shots. This one was a little interesting with this person walking by in the middle, trying to just get her perfectly in the middle. And so she really is the center of attention there. Tilted up, just some interesting buildings on left and right with the palm trees. Here you have a little bit more detail in the clouds because my exposure was a little bit darker with the 1/4000th shutter speed. And so that is that detail I brought back using the dehaze filter that I didn't get with that previous building shot. So I moved my way around to this building that was more of an iconic building in a lot of the photos you see on Google Images. And the issue I immediately had was I'm using a 24mm lens on a crop sensor camera, which means that it's not wide enough to get the entire building in one shot. And so I was trying to get interesting shots, putting the palm trees in the foreground. I backed up and put these bushes with these flowers in the foreground. I actually think that I would have rather had this photo with the flowers in the foreground in focus and the building and the palm trees in the background out of focus, I think that would have been more interesting, because right now it just feels kind of unbalanced. Then I moved backwards again and I saw these flagpoles, and I was having a difficult time trying to get them perfectly straight vertically. And so you can see it's still a little off kilter. I could do a little bit more editing in this photo to make those straight, but this horizontal framing didn't look as good as the vertical framing that I got here with, again, the poles I tried to straighten as much as possible while shooting, and then I also used the upright tool in Lightroom Classic to straighten out those lines a little bit more too. Below these flagpoles is a sign for California State University, Fullerton, and I thought this was interesting, but again, I think using a wider lens would have made this photo better. So what I did to make this more interesting was I moved forward, and then I moved forward again, kind of tilting up my camera, and I made the sign the focus of the shot rather than the entire scene of the building and the sign. And this was my favorite one from this location. I do wish I had that wide lens, but again, it's just one of those challenges when you challenge yourself with a one lens to try to get the shot. Sometimes you just can't get it. So as I was walking back to get picked up before we went and had some lunch, I saw this no dumping drains to ocean sign on the ground, and I just thought it was some interesting textures. In this shot, I also brought down the saturation of all the colors except for the blues in post, just a little interesting. Right before I got picked up, I saw this interesting hallway with these cool leading lines that go down to the distance. You also have these balls of the light fixtures themselves. That's another cool leading line. This one really lent itself to being edited in black and white and cranking up the contrast. So comparing it to the previous shot where you can see a lot of detail in the wall itself and the ground and ceiling, this shot I really brought down the darks and the blacks, and I also cranked up the highlights just so you get this nice contrast, and I also edited it so it was a 16:9 more wide angle shot. And this is actually one of my favorite shots of the day. Really, really cool. The last thing I did was I moved outside of this hallway. There was this stairwell, so you can see the staircase. If you stand on the staircase, you can see the outside. So the previous shot was inside the hallway. This shot is outside. So I took off a shot, but it's not a good shot. It's really boring. There's really nothing about it that is interesting. And so I tried to frame it and compose it in a way that would be a little bit more interesting. So I crouched down behind a pillar and behind the railing of this stairwell, and I just put that wall in the very top left corner. If I took this shot again, I would completely crop out that sky or angle myself so that that sky is not in the photo, and it's just a silhouetted sort of pillar and frame of that textured wall behind, just trying to get more experimental. A lot of people, you just see something, you take a shot, but to become a better photographer, it's all about experimenting with your angles, with your compositions, putting foreground elements, playing with exposure, like I was trying to do here anyways. I also saw this sign. It was the sign of one of the buildings. It said little something or other, and so I used a lot of negative space in this image, again, lending itself to the what's actually in the frame, little, so that I put it in that very bottom part of the frame. And then the last shot of the day was this shot of this building. I think I can drop the exposure or the saturation just a bit, just because those blues in the sky are really, really bright. But this was definitely one of the ones that I edited a little bit more. The sky was not that blue, but I used some blue filters to try to make the sky look blue, just so that it could balance with the orange red of the building.
All right, my time's up and we gotta head out, but I hope you enjoyed following along as I took some photos and showed you my process, and hopefully you thought some of the images were pretty cool. And this lens, the 24mm, is a great kind of walk around lens to practice with, and it was definitely a little bit of a challenge, but that's the beauty of having a prime lens. As always, if you like this video, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and get notifications so that you can be updated whenever we launch a new video here at Video School Online. Thanks so much and have a beautiful day.